Tommy, 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 glue that communicator to your arm. Hey guys, and welcome to another Ranger Rant. I'm Archer9234. Today I'll be discussing episode 59 from MMPR season 1 titled Mighty Morphin Mutants. Again, this footage was filmed in Japan, but this footage was only meant to be used for American audience. So this episode actually doesn't take place in Zyurangers at all. That's one of the reasons why it's very similar to a previous episode that actually was in Zyurangers when the Rangers fought bad versions of themselves. The episode starts off in Angel Grove High, and we basically see that Tommy is late for class, and of course Kimberly's wondering what's going on. And this is basically the first time in PR where they finally acknowledge how Tommy has always been late and forgetting various things throughout the show. If you remember earlier on in season 1, Tommy was always forgetful. Either he was delayed for various reasons, he forgot his morpher was in his bag, his communicator was somewhere else. So this episode basically expands on that issue that Tommy had forgetfulness. Now, the main reason why this character trait of Tommy being forgetful happened was because of dealing with the Borai footage in Zyurangers. If you don't know the backstory of Borai, basically Borai was simply slowly dying in the show. In order to prevent it, he had to stay inside a special, room, so he couldn't always be inside the fight. So that's the reason why the Green Ranger was not really in all the episodes. So they built this backstory of Tommy always being forgetful. So Tommy eventually gets into class, and unfortunately he's been very late, and of course Miss Appleby chews him out, and we basically find out that Miss Appleby is setting up a new class project where you find out like what are your primary faults in order to find and rectify them. I personally particularly like all the school scenes because again it makes you feel like this is a realistic world. At least the Rangers do have to deal with high school problems and projects and all this other stuff. I know a lot of people particularly don't like the school parts because again it's not the superhero aspect of the series. We only care about the characters. We really don't care about the school all that much. But it also gives really fun moments to interact with Bulk and Skull. Now, as usual, Rita, of course, is spying on the Rangers 24/7 and thinks up of a plan while spying on Tommy being forgetful and decides to bring out the special badges of darkness in order to form her special mutant Rangers. Now, the one thing I particularly have to complain about this episode is that while it was a good episode that focused specifically on Tommy and his, his forgetful trait, they went overboard in the episode. I mean, he literally forgot so many things. It kind of got annoying over time. And when you watch the episode more than one time, you kind of start thinking, like, if Tommy was always this forgetful in the show, he wouldn't be there at all in pretty much every episode. He would have forgotten his power morpher and bags more often. His communicator would have been missing in action a lot of times. So he would have been pretty much useless as a Ranger. So as the day progresses, we see Tommy training with Jason, and Tommy and Jason are basically, equal in fighting abilities, but for some reason Tommy is not really paying attention to what he's doing and is forgetting other things, while Tommy is basically thinking, what is my worst trait of me? And of course Jason basically has to say it, it's like, you are very forgetful. Tommy basically forgot his towel, he forgot his water bottle. So while Tommy, Kim, and Trini and the other guys are basically trying to figure out how to get Tommy to not forget his stuff, and we basically see that Goldar is personally training 6 new putties. Now I really like this scene because a lot of times whenever we see the Rangers fight the putties and they always defeated them relatively easy, it always gives you that impression of like, well, do the putties actually train or do anything, or do they simply just create the putties and then they're just simply cannon fodder and actually don't know how to do anything? At least this episode shows that, Goldar is fairly competent and he can actually train people, and we see that the putties can learn and actually, can be very coordinated. Now, the specific reason why Goldar and the putties are training to become the Mutant Rangers is my personal guess is that mainly they're probably trying to mimic the Rangers' fighting moves as best as possible. Because again, even though they're going to become the Mighty Morphin Mutants, that doesn't mean they don't know how to particularly fight as the Rangers. So they basically have to weed out the sucky putties and find out the best putties for the entire mutant team. Unfortunately, though, Goldar was only able to find 5 decent putties, while the 6th putty was not worthy enough to become the Red Ranger. So Goldar basically decided to actually destroy the red badge, which I thought was kind of stupid because I mean, like, okay, so the putties are not actually worthy, but why destroy the badge? You can use it at a later time. So when we head back to Earth and we find Tommy and Kim are heading home, and of course Kim is trying to think of suggestions of how Tommy did not forget stuff, and also of course constantly reminding him, when all of a sudden they're actually ambushed by the Mutant Rangers for the very first time. Now, a lot of times, I always get very aggravated when the Rangers don't morph in a particular circumstance for like this. Why would the Rangers want to fight the Mutant Rangers in civilian form rather than morphing? Fortunately enough, at least the writers did mention to at least write it in, because Kimberly basically said, should we morph? And of course, Tommy said, no, let's see what they can do, which is reasonable. I mean, why simply morph when if you could defeat them normally in civilian form, why waste the energy? Especially that Tommy, it only has a limited supply of energy. Now, let's talk about the Mighty Morphin Mutant suits. Now, the suits are very different to the MMPR suits. For example, the material that the Green Ranger suit is made out of is sort of like a couch liner material, which has that, that kind of cloth reflective material built out. And of course, they have black gloves with no diamonds, and of course, black boots with no diamonds, and a special gray buckle with the weird, kind of thrown together medallion power morpher on their belts. Now, the only thing that basically resembles the actual MMPR suits are the helmets, because I assume it would have probably been too expensive to actually remake the helmets, so they just simply use one of the existing helmets on the suits. Unfortunately, though, the Mutant Rangers are very powerful, and since Tommy stupidly enough said, well, let's not morph, they were overpowered easily, and of course, the Mighty Morphin Mutants simply retreated. Although that was kind of confusing. I mean, they could have easily simply had killed Kimberly and Tommy right at that moment, since they really couldn't do anything. So after Alpha and Zordon basically apprised the Rangers of all the mutant powers, which are basically very similar to them, and they could pretty much equal them in strength and abilities, Tommy and everyone head back to Angel Grove, and of course are trying to help Tommy in his whole forgetfulness. And Billy, again, since he's a genius, decides to help him in a more technical way and builds him a special reminding device. Now, here comes my biggest gripe in the entire episode. Now, while Kimberly is trying to help Tommy, not forget things, and she actually uses this, tie your things around your arm, Tommy takes off his communicator and puts it inside his locker. This is probably the most stupidest thing Tommy could have ever done, because again, the communicator has to be on his wrist 24/7. You have to sleep with it, you have to take a shower with it, because again, you are the heroes for the city, and this is the only device that Zordon can contact you with. So you should never take it off. It just bothered me that Tommy blissfully took it off, and the other Rangers didn't say anything, probably didn't notice, and this basically screws Tommy all the time and even repeats itself in various episodes later on. While Kim and the rest of the guys are trying, truthfully to help Tommy to not forget things, basically made the situation worse and made it even more forgetful, where Tommy was basically getting pissed off and he was late for class and simply walked out on the Rangers. Now, while Tommy's in class, the other 5 Rangers are basically waiting for Rita's next move, and we finally get introduced to the actual leader of the team, Commander Crayfish. Now, thanks to Tommy's communicator being inside of the locker, there's no way for him to be contacted, so unfortunately the other 5 Rangers have to actually face Commander Crayfish and the other 5 Mutant Rangers alone. Now, all this footage is Jutsu footage where the Power Rangers versus the Mutant Rangers. Now, this is one of the very, very few times American audience actually get to see the original Dino Buckler hand gestures. Japan doesn't know how we actually morph in Power Rangers. Of course, traditionally in MMPR, we're behind the thing in order to morph. We actually don't do gestures. Only very few times we actually ever used morphing gestures in MMPR. So in this case, the Mighty Morphin Mutants actually morph using the original Dino Buckler henshin sequence, actually mimicking it perfectly. Although I do like to complain about the actual special effects for it. I assume basically what happened is that normally Saban pays for the Jutsu footage, and usually on the team that actually does the Jutsu footage has to also do the visual effects. But in this case, they most likely didn't pay for any specific visual effects for Japan to actually do for MMPR, so America had to actually do its own morphing sequence for the Mutant Rangers, which is the reason why it looks really, really poor. Now let's talk about the Jutsu Mutant Ranger suits. For whatever reason, the Jutsu versions of the mutant suits actually don't match the US suits. If you look closely, they're slightly different. The gloves and feet are actually darker, the belt is darker as well, and the emblem that replaces the Dino Buckler on the suits is actually a little bit more better detailed. It kind of looks like the Lion Zord from Ninja Storm's head, while in the MMPR footage, the suit looks kind of poor and the buckle looks really cheaply made. Now, when the mutants finally begin fighting the Rangers, we actually get introduced to the mutants having the actual power weapons as well, just like the Rangers do. But in this case, we're actually seeing the original unpowered up state of the Jew Ranger weapons. Now, in Jew Rangers, the personal weapons for the Rangers had a powered up state for when they're in the suit and an unpowered up state when they're just in civilian form. We do get a glimpse of these actual original versions of the weapons during the opening credits of MMPR. Whenever we see the weapons actually, power up and glow their Ranger colors, they're actually transforming into their powered up state. Now, after a while, Tommy eventually gets out of class and actually heads to his locker, where he finally notices that he doesn't have his communicator on, and of course he's delayed in the battle while the other 5 Rangers are actually fighting. Now, the one thing that kind of confused me is that how come the Green Ranger wasn't in the fight at all? It doesn't really make any sense. Why would you not have the Green Ranger in the fight? I mean, it's better for the bad guys because, again, it's 5 versus 6. Why was it 5 versus 5? I'd also like to point out that the Mutant Green Ranger is actually using the Sword of Darkness. Burai and the Green Ranger don't have a powered up state. It's always the Dragon Dagger. Now, unfortunately, the Mutant Rangers are far too powerful, and the Rangers have to basically regroup and retreat back to the command center. This scene is actually kind of bizarre because, again, this is Japanese footage, but it's catering to us, so they actually have to do the teleport sequence for us. Now, when the Rangers head back to the command center, we basically find out that, Alpha has basically improved the Power Ranger weapons. Why waste your time going to the command center when you could have simply just, sent the weapons to the Rangers and they could have continued the fight? Especially when the weapons they were given are the exact same weapons. This scene would have been perfect to introduce, new weapons for the Rangers, basically to sell toys, similar to how Wild Force introduced the Jungle Blaster for the Wild Force team, while in Gao Rangers, that weapon didn't exist, but it existed for us. So eventually the Rangers head back down to Commander Crayfish, and eventually the Rangers begin the fight with their own personal weapons. And of course, since they're now evenly matched, since Alpha did something to tweak them in order to power them up. So of course, Commander Crayfish basically orders the combination of all the Mutant Rangers to form their own Power Blaster. And of course, the Rangers actually all form their own Power Blaster. Now, this scene always kind of made it feel like Tommy was neglected because, unfortunately, for whatever reason, they never actually, in Jew Rangers, actually, thought of, well, let's combine the Green Ranger's Dragon Dagger onto the other 5 weapons to combine into, like, the Super Howling Cannon or something. They just actually never did this. So, of course, the Commander Crayfish and the Rangers actually both fire their Power Blasters, and, of course, the Rangers easily defeat their own Power Blasters, which it kind of makes perfect sense. One, the Mutant Rangers are actually using lower powered versions of their weapons. Now here comes the confusing part with this scene. If you notice, when Commander Crayfish and the other Rangers are actually defeated with the Power Blaster, we see the girls actually jump up from an explosion, but then all of a sudden they're gone. It doesn't really, were they defeated? What happened to them? It wasn't really clear at all, and we just jumped into the Megazord fight. Now this giant fight has to be one of the most awkward fights in PR history. I mean, it was so bizarre because, again, we're fighting with Commander Crayfish, but then 3 giant Rangers. Whenever we see the Rangers giant, it always breaks that wall of believability whenever we see the Megazord, because when we see the giant Rangers, we think of the Megazord as really being, a normal-sized person. Another thing about the fight is that the choreography is kind of weird and confusing. First of all, again, they're fighting relatively slowly. Commander Crayfish is not really doing anything much. Then they do this bizarre thing where Commander Crayfish is lifted up on the 3 guys, and Billy confusingly says, he's out of range of our blaster. What blaster? The Megazord and Dragonzord don't have a blaster. They used finger missiles and a sword. So you could easily have still attacked and defeated him relatively easy with those weapons. So fortunately enough, the Megazord and Dragonzord finally get their upper hand with Commander Crayfish and the other 3 Mutant Rangers, and eventually form the Ultrazord. Now, in this particular case, this is probably one of the very few times we actually ever saw the new and improved Ultrazord formation. Because again, when Saban ordered the Jutsu footage, they also ordered specifically new versions of the Megazord formation, the Dragonzord arising from the water, and the Ultrazord formation. Unfortunately, the new Ultrazord formation was almost never used. I think it was only used one more time after this episode, and it was just forgotten, and they used that stock footage of the normal Ultrazord formation. So as usual, the Ultrazord easily defeats Commander Crayfish and the other Mutant Rangers. So of course, since the other Rangers really didn't help in any particular way in order to get Tommy to be unforgetful, of course the other Rangers are basically saying, well, Tommy, you're always going to be forgetful. This is part of your personality. Although it is kind of particularly bad in this case because, again, he's the superhero of the city, and being forgetful is probably one of the worst traits you can have. Now, the best moment in the episode was with Bulk and Skull. Now, in the beginning of the episode where Miss Appleby basically says, find out one of your traits that you particularly don't like and improve on it. So, of course, Bulk and Skull's most famous traits is basically not being a gentleman, being punks, being very rude. So in this case, they actually decided to actually dress up as gentlemen and basically present Miss Appleby with a present. Now, everyone obviously knows where this is going. So again, this is Bulk and Skull. Can you be gentlemen and open the package up? And of course, Bulk and Skull have to do it because they have to actually pass their grade, and they get sprayed with their own silly string. Now, I have to give this episode a 3 out of 5. It was decent. I mean, it was a really good Tommy episode because, again, it deals with, issues of Tommy's personality, what we had dealt with in past episodes. Why is he forgetting his communicator? He forgets his morpher in his bag. The problem with this episode is that they went overboard with the forgetfulness. I mean, he forgot how many things in the episode. His towel, his water bottle, his communicator, his drink on the juice bar, and his homework, his school book, and so on. It was just a little bit too much. If they had cut out maybe half of those things, it would have been a little bit more tolerable. I also particularly like how Bulk and Skull were still part of the B plot of the story. They were not buried for the main plot of the story with the Mutant Rangers, because again, that was the primary focus, but we still kept up with Tommy's forgetfulness, and of course Bulk and Skull trying to improve their personalities by being gentlemen. So it was really nice to see the payoff at the end. What do you guys personally think about this episode? Do you think this episode was decent enough? Because again, it was a Tommy episode. Or do you agree with me that this episode was kind of annoying because there was too many faults with Tommy forgetting a lot? And because I couldn't really see him being this forgetful, because if they actually kept up with him being this forgetful, he would have constantly forgot fights. Another thing I have to complain about is that this episode should have been the season finale of MMPR. This was episode 59 of season 1 of MMPR, while episode 60 was an oyster stew. Episode 60 really felt more like a standalone episode, while this episode would have been a far more better selection of a season finale for season 1. And I really had wished oyster stew was switched between this position of this episode and this episode moved last. Of course, leave your comments below on what you think on this episode. Of course, leave your suggestions below on future episodes you would like me to review. For next week's rant, I'll be discussing Alien Rangers from Aquitar Part 1. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys right back here next week.